She walked into the diner on her first day, hoping for a chance. Instead, laughter rose as insults cut deep, and her dignity shattered in silence. No one spoke for her, not the customers, not the manager. Fear filled every table, and humiliation felt heavier than the winter snow outside. But someone was watching, a veteran with tired eyes and memories that never stopped aching. He saw himself in her silence. And when humiliation returned the next day, something inside him finally moved. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter morning, Minneapolis. Snow piles against old brick storefronts, breath clouds in the air, and a diner's neon sign flickers against the dull gray sky. Ethan Walker pushed open the door to the Pine and Coal Diner with the quiet weight of someone who had learned to move through life without demanding space. The bell above the entrance chimed in its tired voice, the kind that didn't quite welcome, only acknowledged. The warmth inside struck him first, not in temperature, but in routine. The place smelled like burnt coffee and promises that expired a long time ago. Rex walked beside him with silent awareness, matching Ethan's stride with the instinct of someone who had once served a purpose bigger than food and warmth. Ethan took his usual seat by the window. He didn't need to look at Rex to know the dog was settling down beside him, ready to watch the door and the world outside for threats that no longer came. Ethan wished he could switch off that habit, but part of him feared what would happen if he did. The military trained him to prepare for the worst. Civilian life offered only long stretches of silence, broken by the occasional noise that reminded him of things he didn't want to revisit. Even here, in a place that had become familiar, his eyes scanned the room more than necessary. He caught himself counting exits, one front, one back door into the kitchen, before letting out a slow breath he didn't realize he was holding. The waitress brought him coffee without asking. She didn't smile, but she didn't avoid his gaze either. She just nodded, understanding in a wordless way that didn't feel awkward. Ethan murmured thanks and wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into his palms. He told himself today would be like any other. He'd drink, think too much, think too little, and move on. Minneapolis was just another temporary stop on a long list of places where he tried to figure out what came after a life built around missions and objectives. But the day was not meant to be ordinary. The door chimed again, not with confidence, but hesitation. Snowflakes clung to messy strands of blonde hair as a girl stepped inside, hugging her threadbare coat tight. Her movements were small, careful, like someone afraid to take up space. Ethan noticed how the customers paused, not enough to be rude, just enough to judge. Some looked away quickly, others held their gaze long enough to confirm what they thought they already knew. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she walked toward the counter with the determination of someone who no longer believed in luck, but still believed in trying. Ethan's eyes followed her without meaning to. She spoke quietly to the manager, her voice barely lifted over the murmur of conversations. Ethan didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone, humility bruised by necessity. Whatever she said, the manager frowned, rubbed the back of his neck as if searching for patience he didn't have, then finally handed her a faded apron. She bowed her head, not out of submission, but relief. Ethan read that difference instantly. Her first task was clearing tables. She moved awkwardly, as though every instinct in her body told her she didn't belong here. She bumped into chairs trying to slip past people who didn't bother shifting. Every mistake she made seemed to confirm what she feared they saw in her. Ethan recognized that posture. He had seen soldiers walk that way after losing friends, after carrying guilt so heavy it reshaped their sense of worth. Rex lifted his head. Ethan felt the dog's attention shift, not with aggression, but recognition. Ethan glanced down and saw Rex watching the girl, ears angled just enough to show interest. The dog wasn't reacting to danger. He was reacting to something else, maybe that quiet desperation that animals sensed better than humans. When the girl passed Ethan's table, she nearly dropped her tray trying to balance too many coffee cups. Ethan didn't reach out to steady it. He knew better than to touch someone who was holding themselves together by thin threads. Instead, he said, "First day?" She hesitated, then nodded. Her voice came out rough around the edges. "Just trying to work for food. They needed help today." She didn't say more, but her eyes did. There was hunger there, not just for meals, but for a place to exist without apology. Ethan took a sip of coffee, swallowing the familiar bitterness. He remembered eating cold rations in the dark somewhere overseas and thinking food was fuel. But hunger after service was different, harder to admit, harder to face. He saw something of himself in her silence, the instinct to survive without asking anything of anyone. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing toward the empty booth across from him. She looked startled, unsure whether the invitation was real. Ethan didn't push. He just raised a hand to the waitress. "Add a breakfast plate," he said. "Extra eggs." The girl blinked, confusion etched into her face. "I didn't." "I know," Ethan replied, his tone steady. "It's already ordered." She lowered herself into the booth like she expected the seat to disappear beneath her. Rex rose briefly, as if assessing whether this was safe, then lay down again, head on his paws. She watched the dog cautiously, but Rex met her gaze with a calm that melted some of her tension. Ethan wondered if she saw in the dog what he saw, loyalty unbroken, but not untouched. Her hands shook when the plate arrived, eggs steaming, toast buttered, bacon crisp. She tried to hide the tremor, but Ethan noticed. She ate slowly at first, then faster. Every bite seemed to thaw a part of her that had been frozen long before winter arrived. Ethan looked out the window so she wouldn't feel watched, but he didn't miss the way her breathing steadied. "I'm Lily," she said quietly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand before realizing there was a napkin. She switched quickly, embarrassed, as though old habits might get her thrown out. "Ethan," he replied. He didn't offer more. He wasn't sure how. Lily studied him, not with curiosity, but with caution, the kind of caution survivors gave each other. "The dog?" she asked. "Rex," Ethan said. "He earned the name." Lily nodded, as if understanding more than he'd said. Silence settled between them, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just presence. Ethan realized he had missed that, the simple act of sharing space without needing to explain why. When Lily stood to return to work, Ethan caught the faintest trace of gratitude in her eyes, not for the food, but for being allowed to exist without pity. Rex watched her take up her tray again, more steady now. Ethan knew hunger could be eased in a meal, but dignity took longer. Still something had shifted. Outside, snow fell with patient inevitability. Inside, a girl trying to recover her place in the world took her first steps into a life she hadn't believed she still deserved. And Ethan, who once fought wars no one saw anymore, felt something warm settle in his chest, a reminder that battles worth fighting didn't always look like the ones he trained for. Gray noon light filtered weakly through frost-streaked windows as lunchtime crowds shuffled into the diner to escape the cold wind sweeping along Minneapolis streets. Ethan Walker sat in his usual booth earlier than he intended, hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee that had long gone lukewarm. He told himself he had come only to warm up before heading out again, but a quieter truth sat beneath that excuse. Something about Lily's presence yesterday lingered in his mind, not as pity or obligation, but as a reminder of how survival looked when someone was still learning to trust the ground beneath their feet. Rex rested beside him with watchful calm, not reacting to every movement or noise, only lifting his head when someone walked too close, as if his instincts, once sharpened by commands and discipline, had softened into quiet vigilance. Ethan tried to ignore how the silence inside him felt louder in places like this, how routines filled the hours but did not always fill the space inside his chest. He watched the door without admitting he was doing so. When it opened, Lily stepped in, cheeks flushed from the wind, her apron folded under her arm. She glanced around as though expecting to be told she should not be here, then breathed out softly when no one stopped her. Ethan caught the way her shoulders loosened, how she gripped the apron with both hands as if anchoring herself. She started working immediately, wiping tables with nervous precision, making sure nothing could be criticized. Ethan noticed customers did not look at her the same way they looked at the longtime waitress. They looked through her, as if her place here was temporary and fragile. He recognized the expression because he had seen it mirrored in his own face during his first months home, the gaze of someone afraid they existed only on borrowed time. He wondered if she felt that way about her job or about life itself. Rex raised his head again, watching Lily as she passed. Ethan felt the dog's attention sharpened slightly, not in suspicion, but awareness. Rex had once been trained to respond to stress in people around him, and sometimes Ethan thought the dog sensed what he refused to name. Lily came to Ethan's booth briefly to wipe crumbs from the empty table behind him, and though she tried to work quickly, Ethan saw her hands tremble before she steadied them. She nodded at Ethan, a quiet greeting, polite without being forced, then turned away before the acknowledgement could turn into conversation. Ethan almost called after her, but stopped himself. He did not want to be another person who required something from her before she had the strength to give. Instead, he watched her navigate the dining room with hesitant determination. When the bell above the door rang again, the air in the diner shifted in a way Ethan could not define at first. Conversations lowered just slightly, like the collective inhale before trouble. Officer Ramirez walked in with the confidence of someone who believed every room belonged to him. Ethan knew the type well from his years of service, men who mistook authority for worth, men who welded power like a hammer instead of a shield. Ramirez sat at the counter without looking at anyone, drumming his fingers as though waiting for attention. Lily approached to take his order, voice steady but tense. Ramirez studied her for a moment, expression unreadable, then announced loudly that he wanted someone else to serve him, claiming Lily looked too unkempt to trust near food. Several customers glanced up, others looked away quickly. The manager hurried over to smooth things out, speaking in a low voice Ethan could not fully hear. But the outcome was plain. Lily was told to step outside until things calmed down. She nodded without argument and walked toward the door with mechanical steps. Ethan felt something twist inside him, an uncomfortable mix of recognition and memory. He remembered men being ordered to step aside during deployment, not because they were unfit, but because someone stronger in hierarchy used discomfort as a tool. Rex stood up slowly, as if sensing Ethan's unrest, and Ethan lowered a hand in a calming gesture. He reminded himself he was no longer in uniform, that he could not barge into conflicts without consequence. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the world had once again demanded silence from someone who had too little voice left to lose. Lily sat on the step outside, hands tucked under her arms for warmth, face lowered against the wind. The cold bit through her coat, and Ethan wondered how long she had endured days like this before she walked into the diner asking for a chance. He watched her breathe and saw each breath turn into a small cloud, as if proof she was still here despite everything that tried to erase her. Ethan told himself it was not his place to interfere, yet his body refused to relax, his attention fixed on the door, as if waiting for someone to finally cross a line he could not ignore. Inside the diner, Ramirez laughed at a joke no one else reacted to, acting as though he had accomplished something meaningful by pushing someone weaker aside. Ethan did not move, but his fingers tightened around the mug until his knuckles paled. Rex nudged his leg once, not demanding action, only sensing turmoil. Ethan loosened his grip, but the tension stayed. He reminded himself change did not always begin with confrontation. Sometimes it began with the choice not to look away. He drank what was left of his cold coffee without tasting it. When Lily eventually stood up to return inside, brushing snow from her sleeves, Ethan did not speak. He only shifted slightly to make room as she passed his booth, and Rex lowered his head again in silent acceptance. The quiet between them was fragile, but it felt like something that could become solid over time if neither of them walked away first. Ethan watched Ramirez out of the corner of his eye, aware that next time this happened, he might be unable to stay seated. Lily walked back behind the counter, her movements slower but steadier, and Ethan realized she was choosing to continue rather than disappear. The bell over the diner door jingled again as someone entered behind Ramirez, and the vibration of that small sound carried something subtle through the room, something like the faint tremor before a larger shift. Ethan felt it most in his chest, a sense that today was not the breaking point, but the beginning of a pressure that would build until someone could no longer pretend everything was fine. Wind pressed against the diner's windows, dragging flecks of snow across the glass as Minneapolis settled deeper into a gray winter afternoon. Ethan Walker stayed longer than usual, telling himself it was only because the streets were slick and visibility low, but truth sat heavier beneath that excuse. Part of him could not leave while Lily worked, as if walking out would mean abandoning something he did not yet understand. Rex lay near his feet, eyes half closed, conserving energy the way he always had during uncertain moments. Yet Ethan sensed the dog's ears flick at every raised voice, every tension in the air. Lily moved through the dining room with a steadiness that surprised Ethan, but he noticed how she avoided Ramirez's booth entirely, how she chose routes that kept distance between them. Her shoulders remained square, though her eyes held a guarded stillness, as if something in her had tightened to survive the humiliation of being pushed outside the day before. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled inside him, too many past failures, reminding him how easily intentions could collapse into regret. He told himself she didn't need rescuing, but he could not shake the thought that silence felt too familiar, too close to the version of himself who once returned home and spoke only in necessities. Ramirez arrived again, boots heavy, confidence unchallenged. He ordered loudly, making sure everyone heard, and when Lily approached another table nearby, he chuckled to a man beside him, pretending to whisper about cleanliness, though his voice carried perfectly. The air sharpened. Ethan gripped the fork in his hand, feeling a pulse of irritation that startled him, not because of its strength, but because of how long it had been since emotion had risen so quickly. Rex lifted his head without moving the rest of his body, instincts alert, reading Ethan's posture the way a soldier reads a map. Ethan inhaled slowly, reminding himself that reacting now meant consequences he wasn't sure Lily wanted. She had returned inside yesterday not to fight, but to hold her ground. That resilience made Ethan feel something he hadn't expected, a cautious respect. Time stretched as the lunch rush peaked. The bell kept ringing, voices layered like snowdrifts, heavy, piling without melting. Lily carried plates with both hands, balancing weight, as though the tray steadied her more than her own footing. When she passed Ethan's booth, she nodded again, a small gesture that felt like acknowledgement, not of gratitude, but of presence. Ethan returned the nod, an unspoken agreement that neither of them said aloud. We see what's happening, even if we don't speak of it yet. Ramirez watched that exchange, eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. In his silence, something coiled tighter. When Lily went behind the counter to pick up a new order, Ramirez leaned back and called across the room for more coffee, though his cup was nearly full. The manager hurried to serve him instead, pretending he hadn't seen Lily reach for the pot first. Lily froze for half a second, and Ethan saw her swallow whatever words rose first. She resumed wiping a nearby table, her movements controlled yet strained. Ethan remembered moments overseas when restraint held entire missions together, when one wrong step could unravel months of planning. Yet here, in a simple diner, restraint felt heavier, not because the consequences were larger, but because the injustice was smaller, more personal, and somehow more difficult to justify ignoring. Rex shifted position, resting his chin near Ethan's boot. Ethan lowered a hand as if to steady himself, brushing the dog's head lightly, an instinctive motion that grounded him. He considered standing up, walking to Ramirez's booth, demanding decency, but he hesitated. He hadn't earned that moment yet. Intervention could break Lily's fragile foothold, making her someone others thought needed defending rather than someone who held her place despite insult. The balance felt delicate. Lily brought Ethan a refill without asking, her voice soft but present. When she set the cup down, Ethan saw fatigue in her eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying weight she couldn't put down. "Thanks," he murmured, and though the word was simple, Lily paused as if she heard more beneath it. Ramirez scoffed audibly at the exchange. Someone at another booth shifted uncomfortably. The tension became a fabric stretched across the room, fraying but not yet breaking. The manager announced he was stepping outside for a phone call, disappearing for longer than necessary, leaving the room without authority, letting silence do the work he refused to do. Ethan watched the door close behind him and felt something stir, a recognition that no one remained to enforce the rules except those willing to challenge them. Lily continued her route, but this time when Ramirez called her name loudly, she turned, walked to his table, and asked what he needed with a steady voice. Ramirez requested more coffee again, though he had not touched the first refill the manager gave him. Lily poured it, the cup nearly overflowing, her hand steady despite the tremor Ethan sensed beneath her calm. Ramirez smirked, made a remark Ethan could not fully hear, and Lily nodded without responding. She straightened and walked away, posture unbroken. Ethan exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. Something shifted then, not in noise or movement, but in Ethan himself. He understood that Lily was not waiting for someone to defend her. She was waiting to see who stayed long enough to witness what she carried. When the manager returned, the room felt unchanged on the surface, but Ethan sensed a current building, like pressure beneath ice, invisible until the moment it cracks. He paid his bill without standing up to leave, fingers holding the receipt longer than necessary, as if some part of him wasn't ready to walk out yet. Rex sat up fully now, ears tilted toward the room, his body language quiet but alert. Ethan knew that posture. He'd seen it countless times before action, when instinct sensed a shift, before the mind acknowledged it. Ramirez laughed again, louder, sharper, and Lily paused mid-step. Ethan tightened his grip on the edge of the table, a decision forming faster than he could control. Before he could move, Lily glanced toward him, just once, brief and unreadable, and Ethan felt the moment hinge, as if the next step belonged to someone whose resolve hadn't yet been tested. He rose halfway from his seat without thinking, but Rex pressed gently against his leg, a reminder that timing matters. Ethan sat back down, jaw clenched, feeling the weight of restraint hardening into resolve. Outside, a gust of wind struck the window, rattling it softly. No one looked up, but Ethan felt it, not as weather, but as warning. The bell above the door rang again, though this time the sound carried differently, like a prelude to something that had not yet revealed itself. Ethan did not turn to see who entered. He stayed still, eyes narrowed slightly, breath steady. His muscles tightened the way they once had before impact, and Rex leaned closer, sensing what Ethan hadn't said aloud. The next turn of the story is coming, and Ethan knew he would not be silent much longer. Wind settled into a low howl outside as night deepened over Minneapolis, the diner's lights glowing like small anchors against the cold. Ethan Walker returned at the same hour, telling himself routine was comfort. But inside, he knew it had become something else entirely, a pull he could not name. Rex trotted beside him, not tugging or leading, simply matching his pace with the kind of wordless loyalty Ethan once believed he no longer deserved. The bell rang as they entered, and a few eyes lifted, not at him, but at Lily standing behind the counter, tying her apron with practiced movements that looked steadier than yesterday. Something in Ethan loosened at the sight, though he would never admit it aloud. He took the same booth, ordered the same coffee, yet nothing inside him felt routine. Rex settled near his feet, body still, spirit alert, as if reading Ethan's pulse more precisely than Ethan could. The diner was quieter tonight, fewer customers, fewer voices, but tension lingered like a draft through the doorframe. Ethan watched Lily navigate her tasks, noticing how she hesitated only once when Ramirez wasn't there. His absence wasn't relief, it was anticipation suspended. Ethan's mind drifted to nights overseas when silence before confrontation felt more unbearable than the confrontation itself. He remembered men staring at dark horizons, waiting for something unseen to move. Now he felt that same weight in a diner filled with the scent of coffee and overcooked fries. Lily brought his coffee without being asked. Her voice was soft, but her hands were steady. "Slow night," she murmured. Ethan nodded. Words hovered at the edge of his tongue, questions he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "Are you holding up? Do they treat you better today? Do you regret coming back? Do you know I see you struggling?" He swallowed them, offering only a quiet thank you. She didn't smile, but she didn't retreat, and that felt like a small victory. Rex lifted his head suddenly, ears tuning toward the door before it opened. Ethan glanced over just as Ramirez stepped inside, late but present, wearing authority like a second skin. Lily stiffened, not visibly to most, but Ethan saw the pause in her breath, the way her shoulders rose just slightly before settling again. Ramirez greeted a customer loudly, ensuring his arrival was registered. The manager emerged from the back, expression stiff, pretending not to anticipate trouble. Ethan's chest tightened. He realized he'd been hoping Ramirez wouldn't show, not because confrontation scared him, but because Lily deserved one night without being tested. Ramirez ordered without looking at Lily directly, then changed his mind mid-sentence, forcing the manager to step in. Ethan felt irritation spark inside him, not explosive, but controlled, like a fuse waiting. Rex sensed the shift immediately. The dog raised his head and leaned gently against Ethan's leg, wordlessly reminding him that choices made without thought could cost more than pride. Lily continued working, but her steps were shorter now, her breath quieter. When she took dishes to the kitchen, Ethan noticed her linger longer than necessary, as though the back room gave her just enough space to gather herself before stepping out again. When she returned, Ramirez extended his boot slightly into the aisle, not enough to trip her this time, just enough to remind everyone of yesterday. The room watched without watching. Ethan gripped the edge of his booth. He wasn't sure whether he clenched in anger or restraint. Lily paused for a half-second. She did not walk around the boot. She straightened her shoulders and said, "Sir, could you move your foot so I can pass safely?" She didn't raise her voice, but the entire diner seemed to inhale at once. Ramirez blinked, surprised not by the words, but by their steadiness. He moved his foot slowly, exaggeratedly, then muttered something under his breath. Lily walked on without reacting, her face calm, but her pulse visible at her throat. Ethan felt something subtle, but undeniable. Pride. Not the pride of achievement. He didn't know her well enough for that. But pride that came from witnessing someone choose dignity despite risk. Rex brushed his muzzle against Ethan's boot again, steadying him the way a friend steadies another before they break. Ethan lifted his gaze toward Lily, catching her as she set plates down at a nearby booth. She exhaled then, a quiet release that only someone watching too closely would notice. Their eyes met for a second. No smile, no gratitude, no plea, just two people acknowledging the weight of a moment neither had expected. Ethan felt his thoughts twist in directions he hadn't allowed for years. Maybe silence isn't survival. Maybe survival begins when silence ends. Ramirez watched that exchange with narrowed eyes, interest flickering like a match struck too close to tinder. He leaned back, boots creaking against the floor, and Ethan sensed the beginning of something, not an explosion, not yet, but the first shift of ground before things collapse or finally settle. When Lily passed his table again, Ethan spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for her to hear. "You did nothing wrong." Her breath caught, in surprise, maybe in relief, but she nodded once and moved on. Ethan realized his hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the rediscovery of feeling after too long spent numb. Outside, snow thickened against the windows. Inside, silence thinned. Ethan stayed until closing, not because he intended to intervene, not yet, but because some part of him had decided leaving would mean abandoning something unfinished. When Lily locked the door behind the final customer, she looked exhausted, but lighter somehow, as if holding her ground had loosened a knot she had carried for too long. Ethan rose to leave, Rex following silently. As Ethan passed Ramirez's booth, he heard a low chuckle, just loud enough to register. Ethan didn't turn, but his jaw tightened. Rex pressed close to his leg again, reminding him the moment hadn't arrived, not yet. Outside, wind tugged at Ethan's coat. Lily walked out moments later, pulling her jacket close. She glanced at Ethan, not seeking protection, not offering thanks, just acknowledging presence. It was enough. As Ethan walked toward his truck, Rex halted suddenly, ears sharp, gaze locked back toward the diner's entrance, sensing something unresolved behind those walls. Ethan followed the dog's stare, and in that moment, he felt it too. The shift had begun, but the reckoning had not yet arrived. Outside the diner, snow fell in fine threads under the street lamps, the sidewalks muffled and pale, as Minneapolis sank deeper into winter's silence. Ethan Walker parked across the street again, engine ticking as it cooled, Rex shifting once in the passenger seat, as if sensing Ethan's reluctance to step outside. He wasn't avoiding the cold. Winter meant nothing to him anymore. It was the weight in his chest, the feeling that every visit to this place was pulling him nearer to a reckoning he hadn't chosen. Yet he got out, boots sinking slightly into slush, Rex following at his heel without command. The bell above the diner door rang, and warmth hit Ethan like memory. Heat, voices, routine, things he once thought he would never feel again. He scanned the room, not meaning to, yet unable to stop himself. Lily was there, not behind the counter this time, but sweeping near the entrance, hair tied back loosely, movements careful. She lifted her gaze when she heard the bell, and the smallest pause, not hesitation, not fear, just acknowledgement, passed between them before she returned to her task. Ethan found a booth farther from the window than usual, trying to blend into routine the same way Rex blended into shadow. But Rex did not settle as quickly tonight. His instincts flared at something beneath the surface, something his training could not name but recognized anyway. Anticipation. The room was busy but oddly hushed. Conversations held a softness as though the entire diner breathed with restraint. Ethan watched Lily from the corner of his eye, noticing details he hadn't allowed before, the slight stiffness in her right wrist, the way she adjusted her apron when someone approached too quickly, how her eyes flicked toward the door every few minutes as if prepared for someone's arrival. He wondered whether Ramirez had haunted this space long before yesterday, whether Lily had learned this guarded posture over countless shifts of unsaid humiliation. He wondered if she was bracing for him now. His coffee arrived, not from Lily, but from the manager, who avoided meeting Ethan's eyes. The man's presence felt thinner than usual, like someone struggling to keep peace in a room that no longer accepted neutrality. Ethan thanked him quietly, and the manager nodded once, jaw tight, then retreated. Rex rested his chin near Ethan's knee, eyes scanning movement, posture relaxed, but ready. Ethan sipped the coffee and tried to steady his breathing. He didn't come here to intervene. He didn't come here to watch either. But he didn't know what else to call the thing that drew him back, something between duty, curiosity, and unfinished grief. Lily passed by his booth with a tray balanced in her hands. "Evening," she murmured, not slowing. Ethan replied the same way, voice quiet. It wasn't conversation, not really, but it felt like something had been exchanged, a fragile thread maybe. Rex sniffed the air once, then turned his, gazed toward the entrance. Ethan followed his eyes instinctively. Ramirez wasn't here yet. That absence felt louder than his presence ever had. The room seemed to wait. After nearly an hour, Lily took a brief break, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed loosely, breath fogging slightly against the cold draft from the doorway. Ethan watched without staring. She looked tired, not from work alone, but from something deeper, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying stories inside you with no place to set them down. He recognized it instantly. He carried the same weight. Lily noticed him looking, not directly, but enough that her voice reached him quietly. "He hasn't come in today." Ethan swallowed, unsure whether she wanted reassurance, silence, or nothing at all. "You expecting him?" She shrugged one shoulder, eyes fixed on the window's reflection. "You get used to routine, even when you hate it." Ethan nodded, understanding too well. Rex shifted, ears flicking once, not warning, just awareness. Lily straightened and returned to work, leaving Ethan with the impression that she had shared more than her words allowed. The bell finally rang. Ramirez entered, shaking snow from his coat, boots heavy against the floor. Conversations faltered for half a breath before resuming, more subdued. Ethan's pulse tightened, not because he feared confrontation, but because the moment he had sensed for days felt closer now, its shape forming. Ramirez took his usual booth, glancing around as if checking for something. His eyes landed briefly on Lily, then moved to Ethan, lingering longer than necessary. Ethan felt the stare like static, but didn't respond. Rex sat upright, gaze fixed on Ramirez, not aggressive, just aware, the way a seasoned companion watches the tension of a room before danger has a name. Lily approached Ramirez's booth with measured steps, tray steady. Ethan watched her carefully, not waiting for weakness, but waiting for resolve. "What can I get you?" she asked, voice even. Ramirez leaned back, smirking. "Same as usual." His tone was light, but Ethan heard the blade hidden beneath. Lily wrote the order without reacting, but Ethan saw her knuckles tighten slightly around the pad. She walked away calmly, yet her shoulders were set like someone bracing against wind. Ethan exhaled, slow. He remembered drills in silence, the moments before breaching doors, the breath held before choosing to step forward. But this wasn't combat. It was something quieter, and somehow more dangerous, the kind of battle where dignity and fear collide without making noise. Ramirez ate slowly, dragging the moment out, eyes tracking Lily's movements. Ethan tracked Ramirez with equal restraint, not writing narratives in his head, but reading them anyway. Rex stayed still, posture low, breathing steady, yet his eyes never left Ramirez. When Lily cleared a nearby table, Ramirez called her name again. She paused, tray in hand, then approached without lowering her gaze. Ethan straightened slightly, unable to stop himself. Ramirez tapped his empty plate with a fork. "Refill," he said, though the plate still held untouched fries. Lily hesitated, not from fear, but from something like quiet disappointment. Ethan recognized that expression. He had worn it once when commanding officers demanded mindless compliance. She took the plate and turned. Ramirez added lightly, loud enough for the room, "Try not to drop it this time." A few customers glanced down, pretending not to hear. Ethan's jaw clenched. The manager stiffened behind the counter, but stayed frozen. Lily didn't look back, not once. Ethan felt his restraint stretch thin, not because the insult was directed at her, but because it echoed something deeper inside him. Every moment he stayed silent, when others needed him to speak, every time he convinced himself neutrality was safety. Lily returned with the refill, set it down gently, and said, "Let me know if you need anything else." No tremor, no apology. Ethan exhaled, something heavy loosening in his chest. Ramirez leaned back, gaze shifting between Ethan and Lily as if measuring invisible threads. Ethan met his eyes for the first time, not challenging, not provoking, just refusing to look away. Something passed between them, silent, sharp, unfinished. Ramirez smirked again, but this time the expression held uncertainty. Ethan stood to pay his bill, Rex rising in sync. As Lily handed him change, her fingers brushed his briefly, not intentional, not hesitant, just tired hands meeting another's. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan froze, not because of the words, but because of what lay beneath them. Not gratitude, not dependence, but recognition. He nodded once. "You did nothing wrong," he said again, voice steady. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer this time. Ethan stepped outside but didn't start the engine. He leaned against the truck, Rex beside him, snow settling lightly on their shoulders. The diner lights glowed behind frosted windows, silhouettes moving inside like shadows of a world trying to relearn how to breathe. Ethan felt the moment gathering, not arrival, not conclusion, but a turning. Rex pressed against his leg, steadying him. Ethan inhaled winter air, cold filling his lungs like clarity. Inside the diner, Ramirez stood slowly, eyes fixed on the entrance as if considering a hunt unfinished. Ethan watched the door through the glass. Rex watched Ethan. Something was coming. And this time, Ethan Walker knew he would not be silent. Snow kept falling, finer now, like ash dissolving into night, as Minneapolis held its breath before something inevitable. Ethan Walker returned to the diner again, though this time he didn't bother pretending it was coincidence. He stepped inside with Rex close at his heel, the dog's steady presence grounding him the way discipline once had, when the world felt louder than his own thoughts. The bell above the door chimed, but the sound didn't break anything. Instead, it seemed to confirm what everyone already sensed. Patterns were shifting, routines no longer holding. Ethan chose a booth near the middle of the room, not to be seen, yet not to hide. He told himself he was here to eat, but he knew hunger had nothing to do with it. Rex settled beneath the table without instruction, posture quiet, eyes tracking movement with deliberate calm. Lily was already working, moving between tables with a stillness that wasn't resignation anymore, but something more controlled, like someone rebuilding their footing one step at a time. Ethan watched her take orders, refill cups, wipe tables, each motion steady, even when her gaze flickered briefly toward the door before she caught herself. She wasn't waiting for Ramirez to arrive. She was preparing herself if he did. Ethan understood that kind of readiness, the kind built from long hours of anticipation that wear grooves into the mind. He sipped his coffee slowly, tasting nothing, mind turning in tight circles. He felt pulled between silence and action, remembering moments when speaking up cost men their peace, and moments when staying silent cost more. Rex shifted, sensing the tension inside Ethan long before words formed. The dog pressed its head against his leg once, not urging, just anchoring. Lily brought Ethan a refill without being asked. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the cup down, and Ethan saw her steady them against the table before stepping back. "You sleeping at all?" he asked quietly. Her eyes lifted, not sharply, but with a tired honesty that felt heavier than any answer. "Enough to show up," she replied. Then she walked away to greet a couple entering through the door. Ethan felt something tighten inside him again, frustration, maybe, or guilt, or the faint realization that simply watching was no longer enough. The diner filled slowly, customers settling into booths with heavy coats and red noses. A man at the counter muttered about snowstorms, another wiped slush from his boots, but underneath their words was a silence shaped by memory. The tension of last night, the expectation of what might come next. When the bell rang again, Ethan didn't look up immediately. Rex did. The dog's ears rose, body leaning forward slightly. Ethan followed his gaze and saw Ramirez step inside, shoulders relaxed, but posture claiming space. His eyes scanned the room once before landing briefly on Ethan's booth, moving on without acknowledgement. Lily's shoulders tensed, not visibly to most, but enough for Ethan to see the strain echo down her posture. The manager hurried forward with a practiced smile, as though intercepting Ramirez before trouble reached anyone else. Ramirez ordered something quickly, voice carrying just enough force to remind the room who he believed himself to be. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying his hands around the warm mug. Rex remained still, gaze trained on Ramirez, like instinct reading potential. Lily continued working, but her steps shortened near Ramirez's booth, her breathing quieting each time she passed. Ethan watched without intervening, not from apathy, but from the thin line between letting someone stand and forcing them to depend. Hours overseas had taught him that dignity cannot be given, only recognized. Ramirez ate slowly, pushing food around his plate more than consuming it, eyes tracking Lily as though waiting for her to break. Ethan felt his jaw tighten so sharply his teeth ached. When Lily set a check down, near Ethan's booth, she spoke without looking up. "I'm tired," she whispered. It wasn't complaint, only confession. Ethan swallowed a response he couldn't form. Words felt fragile, insufficient. Instead, he nodded once, hoping the gesture carried enough weight. Minutes passed. Voices rose and softened. Forks scraped plates. The wind outside pressed cold against the windows. Ramirez finally stood to leave, zipping his coat slowly as though daring someone to react. He paused at the counter, saying something low to the manager that Ethan couldn't hear, but the manager's shoulders tensed in a way that said everything. Lily remained near the kitchen doorway, hands folded behind her apron, gaze lowered but posture unbroken. Ramirez walked toward the exit, but halfway there he stopped, just briefly, and glanced over his shoulder at Ethan. It wasn't a challenge, not fully, more like a question. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't look away either. Their silence met in the air like cold steel, neither sharp enough to cut yet, but sharpened by each passing moment. Ramirez stepped outside into snow without another word. The diner exhaled, not relief, not fear, but something between. Lily brushed past Ethan's booth on her way to clear a table. She paused when she realized Ethan was watching her. "I keep thinking it'll get easier," she said softly, "but I don't know if it will." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. What comfort could he offer that didn't feel empty? He thought of all the times he'd told soldiers to stay strong, knowing strength wasn't infinite. He thought of all the nights silence felt like survival, and all the mornings it felt like surrender. Instead of advice, he gave truth. "You're still here," he said. Lily looked at him, not gratefully but thoughtfully, as though weighing the statement. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before turning back to her work. Ethan watched her walk away, realizing that resilience wasn't always loud. It was often this, quiet, tired, persistent. Rex nudged Ethan again, sensing that something unresolved had shifted closer. Ethan finished his coffee, paid his bill, and stood. As he reached the door, he looked back once. Lily was wiping down a booth, back straight, movement slow but steady. It struck him then, sometimes survival wasn't measured in battles won, but in simply returning the next day. Outside, snow swirled under street lamps. Rex stopped at the curb, head lifted toward the diner window, waiting as though expecting something more. Ethan followed his gaze. Inside, Lily turned toward them, only for a second, but long enough for Ethan to see exhaustion and resolve woven together. It felt like a signal, not a call for rescue, not a request for silence, but something else, an unspoken acknowledgement that both of them were standing at the edge of a moment neither could avoid much longer. Ethan placed a hand gently on Rex's back. The dog leaned into the touch, steady and ready. Ethan inhaled winter air, cold filling his lungs with clarity he hadn't felt in years. He realized that he was no longer just watching, he was waiting, and the waiting was nearly over. Snow thickened against the glass as dawn light crept over Minneapolis, the diner opening to a world still half asleep beneath winter's weight. Ethan Walker entered with Rex close beside him, not out of habit anymore, but because something unfinished pressed against his chest. The air inside held a tense quiet that felt strangely expectant, as though everyone sensed what the day might bring without naming it. Lily moved between tables with a steadiness that had deepened into resolve, each motion careful but sure, and Ethan could see how the past days had shaped her posture into something stronger, even if exhaustion still clung to the edges of her eyes. Rex sat near Ethan's booth, breathing slow, internal instincts telling him that patterns were shifting and that his place was beside Ethan for whatever came next. Ethan ordered coffee and forced himself to drink, even though his stomach tightened. He watched Lily pause at the counter to gather her breath before serving the next table, and he recognized the look on her face from nights overseas when soldiers learned to carry on despite the fatigue that settled into bone. The diner was half full when the bell rang again, and Ramirez entered. His presence shifted the room without raising his voice. People spoke more quietly, though no one acknowledged the change. Lily stiffened briefly, then continued working, her movements controlled, but cautious. Ethan felt his hands curl under the table, memories rising of all the times he waited for someone else to step in first, convincing himself silence was safer. Ramirez took his usual booth and waited without calling Lily over. When she approached, he ordered with a tone softer than before, but laced with something that made the air seem thinner. Ethan saw Lily's jaw tighten before she walked away to prepare his meal. A few minutes later, a young customer named Ben, perhaps 19 and new to town, entered and took a seat near Ethan. He asked Lily about available work, explaining he had just arrived after being laid off from a warehouse job. His voice carried a quiet hope that made Ethan think of men trying to rebuild their lives after returning home. Lily listened despite the rush and offered him advice on where to ask, her voice soft but certain. Ben thanked her and ordered breakfast. Ethan watched Ramirez follow the exchange with narrowed eyes, not because the interaction involved him, but because it didn't. When Lily walked past Ramirez again with Ben's order in hand, Ramirez spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. He commented on how quickly the diner seemed to forget who made the rules and how some people didn't know their place. Lily stopped, tray steady, though her breath hitched, and Ethan saw her shoulders draw inward as though bracing against an invisible blow. The manager, who had just entered from the back room, froze at the counter and looked away, as though fear of losing control kept him anchored in place. Ben glanced around, uncertain, sensing tension, but unaware of its history. Rex lifted his head and looked toward Ethan, instincts honed from years of partnership reminding him that hesitation can fracture lives as deeply as violence. Ethan stood slowly, legs steady, breath controlled. He didn't raise his voice or confront Ramirez with anger. Instead, he walked toward Lily's side and spoke quietly enough for their voices to remain anchored in the moment without pulling the whole diner into spectacle. "You did nothing wrong," he said again, but this time not as reassurance. It was recognition. Lily exhaled, steadying herself, and replied with a quiet, "Thank you," that was not gratitude alone, but acknowledgement of having been seen. Ramirez rose from his booth, the scrape of his chair sharper than necessary. He looked between Ethan and Lily, expression tightening. His voice, though controlled, carried provocation. He insisted Lily was making mistakes, that her presence made the diner worse, that discipline was needed. Ethan met his gaze and felt something within himself settle after years of restlessness. He told Ramirez firmly that respect is not owed to uniforms or titles, but earned through conduct, and that targeting someone because they are vulnerable reveals weakness, not authority. The words were calm, but they carried the weight of experiences Ethan no longer hid. The diner went silent, conversations dying mid-sentence. Ben watched wide-eyed. The manager looked trapped between responsibility and fear. Ramirez clenched his jaw, but Ethan's steady gaze kept him still. For a moment, Ethan wondered if the day would end in raised voices or worse, but Ramirez finally looked away first, muttering something about people forgetting their place before gathering his coat. Lily did not move until Ramirez walked past her without looking back. She remained perfectly still until the bell above the door rang, and his silhouette disappeared into the snow. The diner slowly exhaled. Few customers resumed eating, though their movements seemed lighter, as though they were adjusting to a world where something that had weighed them down had finally lifted. Lily turned to Ethan, hands trembling slightly. She did not ask why he spoke up now, and not earlier. She simply said, "Thank you." Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond, but feeling something in him ease. Ben approached Lily and asked quietly whether everything was all right. She answered honestly, "It will be." Ethan paid his bill and prepared to leave. Lily walked with him to the door, not out of dependence, but because something about his presence no longer felt like distance. Outside, snow muffled the world. Rex waited at Ethan's side, the dog's instinct satisfied that his place in this moment had been fulfilled. Ethan opened the truck door but paused, looking back through the frosted window. Inside, Lily helped Ben fill out an application the manager reluctantly provided when he returned from the kitchen. Ethan realized she was no longer surviving in silence, but building something small and new from it. He breathed cold air that stung his lungs with clarity he hadn't felt in years, and understood that stepping forward didn't erase what came before, but it changed what came next. He climbed into the truck, Rex curled at his feet, energy eased, instincts calm. As Ethan drove away, the diner's sign faded behind him, but the tension inside him did not return. It didn't vanish either. It settled. There was no triumph, no applause, no victory in the way stories usually measure change. But something had shifted that could not shift back, and that was enough to end the silence without opening new battles. Ethan drove on through the winter morning, Rex steady beside him, and the diner behind them breathed into a future that no longer felt weighted by the past. In our everyday lives, miracles rarely arrive with thunder or trumpets. Most of the time, they come quietly, through a small act of courage, a word spoken at the right moment, or the simple choice to stand beside someone who feels alone. Some call it strength, others call it kindness. But to those who listen closely to the quiet voice within, it feels like grace, gently placed by God in the hands of ordinary people. If today feels heavy, if darkness presses close, remember this. God never promised easy days, but He promised you would never walk through them alone. Every good you do, every time you defend what is right, every moment you choose compassion over silence, you may become the miracle someone prayed for last night. So if this story touched you, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope still lives. Leave a comment to let others know they're not fighting alone. Subscribe to the channel so together we can spread stories that lift hearts, strengthen faith, and shine light into places that feel forgotten. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and bless the moments when you choose to be a light, even when the world around you feels dark. Amen.